And then in the afternoon, we've got Pettifor, who's joined us from the UK. She's going to be talking about the next crisis that's coming, what's going on in Japan, what's going on with Deutsche Bank in Germany, what finance capital is about to do to all of our lives now that the public services have been stripped bare and left us all exposed to the next crash, and just how imminent that crash is.
After listening to someone who is a political, economic and poetic genius, I think. Start by telling a little tale. I was coming to Dublin and I checked in 24 hours ago, and I wanted to move my seat from the aisle seat, from the window seat to the aisle seat. And I pinged the little symbol that you have to ping, and British Airways said to me, if you want to move from the window to the aisle, that will cost you £15. And I thought, wow, this is really extraordinary, but it's illuminating as well. Because what British Airways has is an asset. It's called an aeroplane, and it's, backed up with infrastructure in a corporation. And they collect rent on that asset every time you and I fly with them. They milk that asset dry. There are no spare seats in these aeroplanes anymore. They pack them like sardines, right? They milk every penny they can out of the asset, which is their aeroplane. And then they find they haven't milked it enough. And some accountant comes up with a brilliant idea. Why don't we charge them for moving from the window to the aisle? And then we can extract even more from this asset. And so it goes on, and you and I know about this every day. We sign a contract with our telephone company. They get this contract for a year, which is a fabulous asset. They sit back on their behinds and they collect rent from us every month, and they give us pretty little service for that rent. Okay. But this thing about rent, the rentier economy, a very unfashionable term, but it's what we're living through. It's a new kind of capitalism. It's not a new kind of capitalism, but it's the way capitalism has evolved. It doesn't just belong to the big bad guys that run British Airways. It's also those people who join Airbnb. They too have an asset, and they rent it out, and expect to be able to earn rent almost effortlessly, because they have to clean up the house and get it all sorted. But they use an asset not to work and to earn, but to collect rent. And the other example, of course, is Uber. So what Uber does is allow people who've got a car, an asset, to use that car to collect additional rent, and to do so without any form of regulation. I'm saying this because this rentier economy is deeply embedded now in our society. We're absorbing it ourselves. We too are becoming rentiers. And sometimes for very good reason. If people rent out their homes, that's because their salaries have fallen and because they've got high levels of debt. They've got to do something to collect some money to balance the books at home. So I'm not blaming them, I'm just simply illustrating how deeply embedded this system of rentier capitalism has become. But the asset that is most extraordinarily valuable is the asset that is really largely scarce. And that, of course, is water. If finance capital can get its hands on that asset, if it can persuade taxpayers to build the infrastructure which enables them to tax that water, the use of water, to collect the rent on that use of water on a monthly basis, they can then sit back, like British Airways, and collect the rent not for the duration of a flight, but for months and even years and decades. Which is why finance capital is so keen to get its hands on the public assets that you and I have built up. Because to make money out of assets, it's better to not have to build those assets. It's better to own a Victorian property in London, which is a pre-existing asset, which was built, 150 years ago. You buy the pre-existing asset and you collect rent on it. Water is a pre-existing asset and the infrastructure around it is a pre-existing asset. The capitalist doesn't have to do anything except get the infrastructure in there for collecting the rent, for guaranteeing the payment of those rents. And that is why they're after your water, and that is why what you're doing is so profoundly important. And I salute you all for this campaign. It's superb. It gets to the very heart of the capitalism that exploits us today. Now, we've lived through a turbulent week in the international capital markets, and when I was coming here, I know the story of Ireland. I've watched the whole process of the financial crisis, of the banks lending crazy money and making huge profits out of it, then crashing not just the Irish economy, but the global economy, and then getting bailed out, getting rewarded. Shareholders, bondholders in the Irish banks didn't have to pay. No. What happened after the crisis was something that really astonished the finance sector. They could not believe their luck. Prior to the crisis, when they lent crazy money to Irish landowners or Irish property owners and developers, they were taking a risk. They were operating according to the laws of the free market, because that Irish developer could have burnt the warehouse down and not repaid the debts. And then they would have lost money. Now, post-crisis, there is no risk. There is no risk for the banks now. At least there wasn't until the 1st of January this year. Because behind the banks stand this taxpayer. The Irish taxpayer, the German taxpayer, the Greek taxpayer, the Italian taxpayer, the British taxpayer, the American taxpayer. They've guaranteed more or less all the activities of those banks. Those banks are no longer private banks. They are effectively nationalised banks. And furthermore, they have to be nationalised because they're not solvent. The crisis that's been happening this last week with Deutsche Bank and other European banks is because the banks are insolvent. And Mr. Schäuble and all of those free marketeers, so-called, and neoliberals said, yeah, we reckon bailing out banks, the taxpayers' money, is not good free market economics. We don't think we want to do it anymore. Next time round, we're going to get shareholders and bondholders to take some of the risk. So they passed a piece of legislation on the 1st of January called bailing in, basically. So rather than bailing out the banks, like they're going to do what they did in Cyprus, is they're going to make deposit holders and shareholders take some of the pain. That happened on the 1st of January. By the 1st of February, the shareholders and bondholders were up in arms. No way were they going to take that risk. They're getting out of the banks. Because if they're exposed to these insolvent banks, that ain't funny. So what we've seen in this last week is we've seen a stampede of shareholders saying, we don't have nothing to do with these banks, because no longer are the governments going to bail them out, is what they think. We all know that Deutsche Bank's going to be bailed out. The German taxpayer is going to protect the bank. But the shareholders are slightly worried because there's new EU legislation which says they might have to be bailed in. But what it shows us more than anything else is that these huge, big financial institutions are effectively insolvent, and we are holding them up. The Irish people, in particular, are playing this heroic role of funding the Irish banks. If you don't believe me, let me read you what I have discovered on the front page of the Central Bank of Ireland yesterday. Irish households, is written there, were net funders of the Irish banking system for the 6th consecutive month in December 2015. This means that deposits held by Irish banks from households have exceeded on-balance sheet loans owed by households since July 2015. This is the first time the value of outstanding loans fell below the level of deposits held since the 1990s. This is said in cool language. It is incredibly bizarre. We invented a banking system back in the 1650s, 70s and 90s for the sole purpose of mobilizing finance to lend into the real economy to finance real economic activity and in particular employment. That's what banks are for. And now we are financing the banks. The real economy is funding the banks. And the Irish people are funding the banks because they're putting more money into the banks than the banks are lending to the Irish people. As the Bank of Ireland admits, this is unprecedented. And it's bizarre. It shows you that the system is broken. The whole system is broken. This isn't just one broken bank or 2 or 3 broken Irish banks. This is a whole global financial system that is broken. But unfortunately, our masters, Wall Street, the City of London, Frankfurt, the governors of the central banks, cannot face this reality. It's too painful a reality. Because if it's broken, then the architects of it devised a pretty lousy system. It's like an architect building a house without foundations, and then it falls down. The architect becomes deeply embarrassed. But when the house falls down, it's kind of visible for the whole world to see. But we don't see that the financial system is broken. We see them swanning around, we see them lobbying, we see them being defended. We see them living in these grand buildings that they live in. We see them occupying parliaments and so on and so forth. But in fact, they're living in a broken down, collapsed house. The financial system, the global financial system. Now this matters as we think about strategy for a campaign like this one. Because we have to understand and locate this campaign within what is happening out there. And I want you to understand it because I want you to take courage. I don't think that we can change the minds of the people who now run the world, including our own countries. I can't see progressive people winning the Irish election. Forgive me, but I'm a little biased on this. I'm a little bit cynical about it. I can't even see this happening in other countries. Bernie Sanders is very exciting. But I think Donald Trump's got a much better chance of winning the next presidential election than Bernie Sanders has, because he's got all that money. So I'm a little bit worried about that. But what I know is that they're working with a very broken system, and that it is going to collapse, and the institutions are in the process of collapsing. Who knows perhaps what the timing will be? Not me. I'm not good on predicting timing. I predicted the financial crisis back in 2003. That was of no use whatsoever to anybody planning strategy. So I'm not sure about the timing, but I do know that the thing is going to fall apart. And then the question is, where will we be? And that is something that I really want you all to address, because I've heard, and I know you've heard, complaints about the Irish population and about the passivity with which Ireland was rolled over by the banks, by the IMF, and by the European institutions. I've heard what you've heard. I've heard Mr. Schäuble say that he is envious of the Irish recovery. You know? I've heard all this stuff, so we all know what is being said. But I want us to understand that actually it's very, very precarious out there. And one of the reasons for the Irish, in my view, passivity, is that what happened both before and after the crisis is that the Irish people were buried in debt. I'm staggered by the numbers. I looked at the Central Statistical Office's numbers for private debt. Private debt in Ireland is twice the size of government debt. It's massive. It's massive relative to your annual income as a nation, twice or three times the nation's income. And it's 170% of household incomes. Household debt is 170% of what households can expect to earn in a year. That's a hell of a lot. When you take out a mortgage, you don't take out 170% mortgage, do you? Or that uses up 170% of your income. So it is a really big weight. If I was Irish and indebted, I would keep my head down too. Really important to do something about that debt and to just kind of conserve things, because it's very dangerous to be burdened by an overhang of debt, as we all know. Now, immediately after the crisis, central banks lowered interest rates, and people thought, well, maybe it's not going to be too bad, because interest rates are lower. And actually now I find I'm not spending quite so much on my mortgage. I've got more money in the bank. I can go shopping. But that doesn't take away the overhang of debt, of private debt. The governments care not a tosh about this private debt. They don't feel any responsibility for it, although it's entirely down to government policy, to liberalisation of finance, to the freeing up of banks, to lend crazy money without ever asking what that money was lent for. In the old days, you couldn't take out a mortgage unless you could show that you could pay for the mortgage. You could show you had a decent job, and there was likely to be a secure job. You were asked questions, deep questions. I remember going for a mortgage in the 1970s with my husband, and the bank manager sitting us down and asking us deep questions about the nature of our work, our qualifications, and the state of our marriage. Were we going to be married for 25 years and pay off this mortgage? Oh yes, we said we were. And actually we were telling fibs, because we weren't. We got divorced. Nowadays, when my son goes for a mortgage to buy a house in London, because he has to work in London, because that's where his work is, and he's got kids, and he has to have a roof over their head, he got one a couple of years ago, more or less from a voice at the end of a telephone. That's what's happened. We no longer have regulations and management of the way in which finance is created and lent into the economy in ways that is productive and repayable. Now, I'm in favour of credit, because without credit, if you work in Africa, as I have done, where they don't have monetary systems and they don't have monetary institutions, there is no money. It's not complicated. So if you have a good monetary system with contract law, with a criminal justice system, with an independent central bank, with a sound currency, which the central bank is responsible for, and with a good accountancy system and a good taxation system, if you have all those institutions in place, credit is a great thing. But then credit has to be managed. It has to be lent for productive income-generating activity. And what is the best productive income-generating activity? Employment. If money is lent into the real economy to create jobs and to create employment, as you and I know, when you have employment, you get income. That's the joy of employment. But instead what has happened is, money is now used for speculation. Money is now used to buy up a pre-existing asset, like a property or an aeroplane, or a brand, or a racehorse, or stocks and shares, and then to gamble on whether or not you can carry on collecting rent from that asset. And that change in the way we looked and managed credit is what gave us this massive bubble, this massive overhang of debt, which now presses down on the people of Ireland. And if that were not bad enough, the economists and the bankers and the politicians in charge of our economy have so managed the economy that it's deflating. Now, you and I have never lived through a deflationary era. We don't know what it's like. None of us here been alive in a deflation. We've lived through inflation. When I took out my mortgage, it was in the 70s, it was inflationary, and it was eroded in real terms. I paid back less in real terms than I had borrowed, because my wage went up and prices went up. And so my mortgage shrank as a share of my income. Exactly the opposite happens in a deflationary environment. Your mortgage rises because your wage is falling, or if you're a small business and your prices are falling, you know, wages can go negative, i.e. you can lose your job. They can go negative 20, 50%, can't they? Prices can go negative. You can go grow tomatoes and you might be forced to go to the market and flog them for less than it cost you to grow those tomatoes. In those circumstances, the real cost and value of debt rises. And that is why the IMF, which is the agent of all creditors, international creditors, loves deflationary policies. So what we're seeing now is that prices are falling. Commodity prices are falling because of this overhang of debt, which isn't just an Irish phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. It's the case in the United States, it's the case in Britain. Britain is probably the second most indebted in private debt terms in the world. It's the case in Japan, and now it's increasingly the case in Europe. That overhang of debt depresses economic activity and demand. People don't go shopping, they don't make things. And then that, in turn, brings down prices. Think of the steel industry. Prices fall. Then that causes businesses to go bust. That then results in unemployment. And when people are unemployed, they spend even less. And their debt relative to their income grows even higher. That's what we're living through now. But my Chancellor, George Osborne, tells me this is very good deflation. That I should be incredibly happy that oil prices have fallen because I've got now much more money to spend. By the way, so is British Airways. We've got much more money to spend. In fact, the falls in commodity prices are a signal of a very, very deflating economy, and it is terrifying. Terrifying in the sense that the level of debt is so high and is rising relative to the rest of the economy. So the whole thing's going to fall down at some point. Are we going to be ready at that moment with alternative economic strategies, with alternative ideas, and with having helped to, if you like, inform and build the capacity of our civil society so that our reaction to this crisis isn't to join the fascists and call for a strong man to take control, but rather to take a democratic approach and a peoples-based approach to the resolution of the crisis. In the 1920s and 30s, in the 1920s they lived through deflation. They had this massive crisis, the stock market crashed in 1929, and then they had the Great Depression. Two things happened. Here in Europe, Hitler came to power. The people felt that they could no longer cope with the misery of liberal finance. It was just immiserating them. And they wanted to escape from the forces of free market, as Karl Polanyi has explained so well. And they therefore turned to a strong man to say, will you take control of this wild market that's doing all this stuff to us and protect us from it? And so they went for strong men, and they invariably were men, fascists. But something different happened in Britain and in the United States. Roosevelt came to power in the United States, and he's a bit like Bernie Sanders. And what we're watching happening in the primaries in today sort of reflects what happened when Roosevelt went through the primaries, because he too was up against a Wall Street candidate. And he had a bunch of union fixers who fixed for him. And somehow, we don't know quite how, they defeated the Wall Street candidate, even though they didn't have that kind of money. And a Democrat came to power in 1933. I urge you all to find his inaugural speech. It's as relevant to us today as it was then. And it takes aim, of course, at the finance sector. But the really interesting thing is that soon after he came to power, the neoliberal financial establishment, the equivalent today of what was then an IMF, like the IMF in the 1930s, plus all the bankers, wanted to convene a conference to restore the system that had prevailed, that had caused the 29 financial crisis, fundamentally the gold standard. And they wrote to Roosevelt and they said, please come to our conference because we want to reinstate the old system. And he said, go and jump in the lake. I'm not coming to your conference. And with that single letter, he sort of single-handedly blew up the whole system. The United States came off the gold standard. Thanks to Keynes, Britain came off the gold standard, and recovery began in the United States. He began to create employment. He reined in the banks. He started to pursue the interests of the people. The opposite happened in Europe. Now we have to just bear that in mind, because we are going to face a similar crisis to what they faced in the 30s. And we're going to have to exercise political leadership so that we don't end up in the way they ended up in the 1930s and in a calamitous, catastrophic war. Because that is the way we could head if people become utterly full of despair. So this is my cheerful message to you all. But I wanted to just end on this note. I, as was mentioned, was called upon to run a campaign to write off the debts of the poorest countries back in the early 90s. And when I got invited to go for the interview, I said to them, you can't do this. You can't. They said, we would like you to go to Washington and to persuade the IMF and the World Bank to write off these debts. And I said, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. I said, I'm a powerful cookie. I think I'm smart, but I'm not that good. I said, you have to have a social movement. And they said, nah. You can't build a social movement around international financial architecture and sovereign debts and countries that are far away from you. You can't do that, they said. Well, I said, if you don't do that, you'll never cancel the debt. And to my astonishment, because I was pretty rude to them in the interview, to my astonishment, they hired me. And we began to mobilize. And we mobilized people in more than 60 countries around the world. The IMF could not believe what happened within 6 years. And we mobilized them primarily because we informed them. I'd like to say educated, but they understood an awful lot. They just didn't have the information. They had the wit. We never underestimated their intelligence. That was a fundamental principle of our campaign. Never underestimate the ability of your audience, no matter how ordinary they may appear to be, to understand the complexities of the international financial system and economics. Never underestimate it, because we did not. The IMF did. British government did. When we mobilized 100,000 people to the G8 summit in Birmingham in 1998, the Foreign Office couldn't believe that we were going to get that many people. In fact, they went to great lengths to outwit us. And actually, Bill Clinton was coming. This was his first G8, and Yeltsin and so on. And so in order to puncture to our little balloon, they announced the day before the summit that they were taking Clinton and Yeltsin and everybody to a castle in the countryside, and there was going to be no point in demonstrating. And I'll never forget, I felt terrible. I thought, all this effort we've made to mobilize, and the money we've spent, and the hours of meetings up and down the country, and all the slog, and it's been really painful. And now the bastards have gone and moved out of town, and people are going to feel there's no point in coming. Excuse my language. And I'll never forget the moment I stood in the Methodist Church's building outside Birmingham Station. And around about 11 o'clock, the doors of Birmingham Station opened up, and 100,000 people turned up. So there was 100,000 people, but there were no world leaders. Fortunately, there were 3,000 journalists, and they had nothing to do, because the leaders are all left out. So the next thing, I get a call from Tony Blair's office. Excuse me, we're coming back. We'll be back in half an hour. They flew back into Birmingham because the media had said, what are all these people doing here about debt? Well, we didn't know that. We didn't know this, blah, blah. And we grabbed all the media. And so we actually forced those leaders to come back into Birmingham and face the music. And then, as is said, we had about 100 billion. We didn't reach our goal. We would have liked a lot more to be written off than $100 billion. But it meant a lot to the countries of Africa that got written off. And we altered the dynamic between debtors and the IMF. The IMF very nearly lost its raison d'etre. It was about to go under until Greece came along. Suddenly, the IMF had something to do, because so many countries got out from underneath the IMF as a result of the debt cancellation. Nigeria, Brazil, all decided, no, we're not going there anymore for money. And the IMF was in difficulty, made its money out of lending. And then Greece came along and saved their bacon, and they're now at the centre of it all again. So we did a lot with a very simple campaign. We mobilised. And what I know more than anything else was that the thing that really put 100,000 people onto the streets of Birmingham wasn't sophisticated marketing and all of that stuff. It was that these people had something in their gut, a sense of profound anger, and that came from a real understanding of what was happening. They were no longer confused. They got it. And when they got it, they were mad as hell. And they wanted something doing. And so I want to encourage you, because you were doing what we were doing, and you're probably not at the end of that, you're probably halfway there, but I want you to keep going, because we can change the world, and it is possible. But first of all, we have to share understanding on a great scale. Thank you very much.